Last week, I brought up the topic of tithing, and that tends to make people tense. People really kind of hate it when you start talking about tithing. And I know this from personal experience. My grandparents, Grandma and Grandpa Becker, were both raised Lutheran, and they went to church regularly. But as the lore goes, as the family story goes, sometime before my dad was born, the pastor of the church came to visit them at home, specifically to talk to them about their giving, and he encouraged them to tithe. Well, I don't know what was said in that conversation, but I do know that the pastor was invited to leave their house, and that from that day forward, for the next 70 years, neither one of my grandparents ever went to church again. Now, in the case of my grandparents, that sort of thing happened every now and again. Ida Lucille Temple Becker was the Queen Grand Mistress of Petty Grievance Nursing. One time in the 70s, she received word that her sister Gwendolyn, to whom she had not spoken in over 30 years because of some falling out, had moved into a new house in Rogers, Arkansas. So she and Grandpa got in the car and drove to Rogers from Hutchinson, a 700-mile round trip, so that she could drive by her sister's house and not visit. And there are lots of other stories I could tell you that would only begin to plumb the depth and the height and the length and the breadth and of the sheer magnitude and self-regenerative power of Lucille Becker's enduring enthusiasm for keeping wounds open as long as humanly possible. Nevertheless, even in Lucilian terms, a 7-decade grudge against the church on behalf of a minister who died 50 years before the grudge did seems pretty remarkable. Until you remember what it was that offended her and Grandpa in the first place. Because what that minister came to their house to talk to them about was pretty extreme. I mean, remember, this conversation took place back in the mid-20s. There are all kinds of things this guy could have brought up in that conversation that would have been less offensive than what he did bring up. He could have talked to them about prohibition. That would have been fine, though Grandpa did have a microbrewery in the basement of their house during Prohibition. He could have brought up women's suffrage. That was a hot topic at the time. Grandma would have given him an earful if he had been of a dissenting opinion, but they wouldn't have kicked him out of the house. He could have broached the subject of evolution. Remember, the Scopes monkey trial was in 1925. And they would have entertained his thoughts on that topic. They considered themselves to be enlightened people. He would have been free to talk to them about abortion. Eugenics was a very popular topic at that time. No one knew the atrocities of Hitler and Stalin were on the horizon, and the idea of trusting the science and allowing doctors in hilltop hospitals to cleanse the population of undesirables was a fairly common topic of polite conversation among Americans at that time. He could have had a very civil discussion with them about that. He might even have dared to talk to them about the Great War, which wasn't yet known as World War I, since no one knew World War II was coming. He could have brought up the fact that Grandpa was the son of first-generation German immigrants and asked him about his service as a medic in the trenches of France. Now, if he had done that, he most assuredly would have walked away with fewer teeth than he had in his mouth when he first arrived. But Grandma and Grandpa wouldn't have quit the church about that. After all, it was a German Lutheran church. My point is that there are all kinds of things that this pastor could have brought up in his visit to my grandparents that could have offended them, could have offended their sensibilities, could have strained their relationship with the church, But there's only one topic that he could have brought up that was certain to sever their relationship with the church. And that was the topic of tithing. And that's the one he chose. And the rest of the story, as they say, is history. That's how offensive the topic of tithing is to many people, and not just to crazy people. I mean, I know how strange my family sounds to some of you when I tell some of the stories of my life. I'm free to concede that, yes, the Beckers are a quirky lot. But this isn't the story that illustrates that point, because lots of people are offended when you start talking about tithing. And not just because as soon as the topic comes up, people begin to feel that the preacher has crossed the line from preaching to meddling. Though that's certainly a factor. I mean, people don't like it when they perceive that someone's trying to get in their pocketbook. But it goes beyond that. Because clearly lots and lots of people are persuaded that teaching on tithing is bad theology. I mean, you type the phrase tithing error into Google with quotes, press enter, and you'll get thousands of results. Tithing heresy gets hundreds. The phrase tithing is not biblical, in quotes, produces over 7,000 articles. The phrase tithing is evil yields 42,000 returns. Tithing is a lie produces 35,000. Tithing is wrong and tithing is bad each produce 124,000. And searching for tithing in quotes along with spiritual abuse in quotes yields almost 150,000 results. People have dedicated a lot of time, a lot of attention, a lot of effort, and a lot of ink to teaching against tithing. And this topic is of particular concern in our tradition. If you go to Google and type in tithing in quotes and Church of Christ in quotes, you'll find that you'll get just over 1.4 million articles. Now, they're not all negative, but the first 25 that I clicked on were. Beloved, this is a question that believers of all stripes are keenly interested in. This really seems to matter to people, and people do not agree about it. I believe in tithing, in quotes, and I don't believe in tithing, in quotes, just about tied, each getting about 10,000 results. I found 7,000 articles online with people testifying about how and why they started tithing or began tithing, but I found about 30,000 with people explaining why they stopped tithing or quit tithing. I found 31,000 websites with articles that state straight out, not just that tithing is bad theology, not just that teaching on tithing is misguided or is wrongfully applied to the New Testament, but that tithing itself is a sin. I mean, I typed tithing is a sin in quotes into Google, and that search got 31,000 hits. $31,000 people who believe that if you are tithing, you are sinning. And they don't just believe that strongly enough to say it, they believe it strongly enough to put it in writing and to post it on the internet for the whole world to see. Now, how do you account for that? Where does that kind of hostility come from? Where does that kind of animus come from? Why do people feel so strongly about this? Well, I think apart from protecting their assets, apart from having a sense of self-preservation and being suspicious in general of people who tell them that the Bible teaches us to give, which people don't usually say out loud, but which I assume is part of human nature. The only choice we really have is to rely on what people tell us, to rely on the explanations that people give, to what people say as to why they're against tithing. And the rationales that people give most often about why they have so many misgivings about tithing are theological. That is, people base their objections against tithing on the Bible, on their understanding of what the Bible says on the matter. And the single most cited rationale for dismissing the tithe as something that's foreign to Christianity is that tithing is part of the law. The command to tithe was given in the law of Moses, and according to the New Testament, we're free from the law of Moses. And if we were to teach or to practice tithing, then we would be doing exactly what Paul warns us not to do in Galatians 3, putting us in violation of the New Testament. Now, that's a serious charge, because if that's right, if that's accurate, if it's true, if it really is the case that tithing is a product of the law, and if it really is so that doing things that have been commanded in the law of Moses is a sin, then tithing would indeed be a big no-no. And it would be incumbent upon us as faithful followers of the new covenant to avoid it at all costs. So with that in mind, I want to examine that question. I want to spend the rest of our time this morning examining that charge and see what we find. And I want to begin with the second part of that accusation, the charge that doing things that are commanded under the law puts us in violation of the new covenant and nullifies the grace of Christ. Because this is actually the easiest part of that argument to address. And all it takes is 2 minutes reflection and a couple of quick examples to see and understand that this is obviously wrong. For instance, in Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 7, the children of Israel were commanded to know the Shema and to recite it on a regular basis. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. Now, according to the rationale of this anti-tithing argument, any Christian who does, in fact, memorize the Shema, that is, verses 4 and 5 of this text, and who, in fact, recites it on a regular basis, would be guilty of sin. You've made yourself a slave to the law, and you've nullified the grace of Christ, setting it at naught. Well, I've got a question for you. Do you remember the first song we sang in our worship services today? Number 446, Hear, O Israel. Now, we all know good and well that we know the words of that song by heart, and that we had our books open to the song, but we didn't need the books not to sing it. We didn't need the books of that song. We know it very well. Beloved, we all have the Shema memorized, and we all recite it on a regular basis. sinners. You got to be ashamed of yourselves. Similarly, in Deuteronomy 31:19, the Israelites were commanded to learn the Song of Moses and to sing it in celebration of crossing over the Jordan into the Promised Land. Now, therefore, write this song and teach it to the people of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the people of Israel. Well, brothers and sisters, do you remember the second and the third songs that we sang this morning? Number 886, On Jordan's Stormy Banks, is written from the perspective of Moses in Exodus 32, 48 through 52, looking over the Jordan River, wistfully anticipating its crossing. And it repeats the command of Deuteronomy 31 4 times. Sing the song of Moses. Reprobates, backsliders, shame on you. I could give more examples, but no more are needed. You get the idea. You get the point. Just because we're free from the law doesn't mean that everything commanded under the law is forbidden to us. If it did mean that, then that would mean that Jesus commanded us to sin in Matthew 22, when he commanded us to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Well, that's ridiculous. Now, beloved, by the count of Jewish scholars, there are 613 commands given to the children of Israel under the law of Moses. Do you know them? Can you name them? Do you think it would be wise to spend the rest of your life attempting to avoid them all for fear of violating Galatians 3? Well, no, of course not. And good for you. It's a foolish idea based on a false premise that living within the law is the same thing as being beholden to it. They're not the same thing. And no one with any sense would suggest that they are. The only way that any such thing could become folly to us would be if we bound them on ourselves as laws and compelled ourselves or compelled others to keep them as though they were binding on us in a legal sense. And the same goes for tithing. Every Christian is free to tithe if they want to. As I pointed out last week, we don't have to calculate our giving as a percentage of what we have. No, every one of us is free to give any amount of money that we desire to give, as each of us has determined in his own heart, not out of compulsion, but out of joy, for God loves a cheerful giver. You can choose any amount within your means to give, and give that amount, even if that ends up being a tithe. Tithing is not forbidden, and anyone who says it is not thinking clearly. And that would be true even if the tithe were a product of the law. That would be true even if the first and only references to tithing in the Bible were found within the corpus of the law of Moses. But that isn't true either. That isn't the case. And this is important because the basis on which people imagine that tithing is prohibited under the new covenant is that tithing is a product of the law. But beloved, that premise is false, and it's an easy matter to demonstrate its falsehood in short order. Because in order for the tithe to be a product of the law, it would have to find its origins in the law. But its origins aren't in the law. And we know that because Abraham was a tither. And he was tithing some 430 years before the law was given. Genesis 14, 17 through 20. After his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, The king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of all that he had. Beloved, it's one thing to ask which came first, the chicken or the egg. But it's another thing entirely to ask which came first, the tithe or the law. Because the answer to that question is simple and straightforward. Tithing predates the law by nearly half a millennia, at least. In order for the tithe to be a product of the law would have had to have been before it was. That's an absurd proposition. It has no merit whatsoever. And because it has no merit, the entire proposition falls. Brothers and sisters, if you have ever been put off tithing because you had been told that it's sinful, misguided, or wrong to calculate your giving in that way, hear me and hear me now and hear the word of God now. There is nothing in the Bible that prohibits you from tithing. You are free in Christ to give as much or as little as you want to give, even if what you want to give is 10% of all that you have. And those who say that tithing under the new covenant is folly because tithing is a product of the law and voluntarily living within the law nullifies the grace of Christ are wrong on both points. You are as free to tithe as you are to honor your father and your mother, or to keep the Sabbath, or to refrain from eating shellfish. The only thing you're prohibited from doing in regard to the law and in regard to tithing is to bind it upon yourself or to bind it on others as a law and put yourself or put others under bondage to the law. That's the sin that Paul calls out in Galatians 3. Now, if I were you, I would find what I've just told you to be persuasive. But I wouldn't necessarily find it compelling. And that's a distinction with a difference. Because it's one thing to be free to do something, but it's another thing entirely to have a reason to do it. I remember back when everyone had landlines. They used to get itemized bills from the phone company every month. Remember that, getting a bill from Southwestern Bell? It was on paper the size of computer punch cards, and it was always 20 or 30 pages in length. And all of your charges were itemized and enumerated. Well, there was one charge on that bill every month that always annoyed the fool out of me. And that was a line item toward the bottom of the bill that said, legally allowed line charge. Or something like that. Now, the charge was only about $3. But that used to really get under my skin. I mean, it was only $3 a month, but I paid it for 30 years. That adds up to about $1,000. If I could have that money back right now with interest accrued, I could buy 100 ounces of silver and be prepared for the coming financial downturn that William Devane keeps telling us is coming. I remember one time when I was in my late 20s, I called the phone company and I asked them what that charge was for. Well, they couldn't tell me what it was for. All they could tell me was that they were legally allowed to charge it. And I responded, well, yes, but allowed isn't the same thing as compelled. It isn't mandated. I mean, yes, you're allowed to charge it, but that doesn't mean you have to. No one's holding a gun to your head. You're free to charge it, but you're also free not to charge it. And the reason I'm calling is to see if I can persuade you to exercise your freedom and remove this charge from my bill. Well, it turns out they weren't interested in exercising their freedom. That's not terribly surprising. After all, they had no compelling reason to do so. Because, beloved, it's one thing to be free to do something, but it's another thing to have a good reason to do it. That applies to tithing as well. Now, if you've been told all of your life, and many, many people in our tradition have been told this, that you shouldn't tithe because tithing nullifies the grace of Christ, then you might find yourself informed by today's lesson. But most of you probably aren't relieved to hear what I've told you today. Now, you might be. If you're a curious thinker like I am, you've always found the arguments against tithing to be hinky, never been quite able to lay your finger on why they didn't add up. Now, I've told you why they don't add up, why they don't seem to add up. It's because they don't add up. And I think knowing is better than not knowing. Knowing is better than wondering. Knowing is better than having an itch that you can't quite scratch. So you might find what I've told you today somewhat satisfying, but I'm guessing that most of you probably not been looking too hard to find your way around the supposed prohibition against tithing. I mean, I'd be surprised if someone contacted me after this lesson and said, you know, I've always wanted to give more, but I've been afraid to. Because I didn't want the consequences of doing so. I didn't want to nullify my salvation. I've been told all my life that tithing is of the devil, and that if you tithe, you become a slave to the law. You set the grace of Christ at naught. But thanks be to God, your lesson has set me free from those fears. I've always wanted to tithe, and now, thanks to my newfound freedom, I'm going to start doing that next week. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. Having the freedom to do something is not the same thing as having reason to do it. And if you've never been a tither, you're going to need more than permission to start tithing, or to even want to start tithing. Because a tithe seems pretty steep if you're not accustomed to giving that much. You know, in my home congregation, they used to track people's giving, and all congregations do now. It became law during the Clinton administration, but prior to that, it wasn't a requirement. But every year after the first of the year, my church sent out receipt letters to every adult in the congregation. They didn't send contribution letters to minors, just to the adults. Now, I started working an after-school job when I was 14, and I was prospering as much as any teenager with a part-time job prospers. But I wasn't paying any attention to 1 Corinthians 16. I wasn't paying attention to what Paul said when he said, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so also are you to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. Well, I wasn't paying any attention to that, not really. I mean, the church took up a collection every week, but there was never any real teaching on giving. Whoever lost the lottery that Sunday in the communion servers roundup always said a few words over the collection. But very rarely did those men put any real thought into what they were going to say. And what they usually said was basically an apology for having to take the collection. They'd say something about the needs of the church. and it being convenient right now. So we'll just do it while the ushers are standing here. Well, I had the church bulletin right in front of me, and as far as I could tell, the church wasn't in need. I could read that simplified balance sheet on the back of the bulletin. The church was doing just fine. And I felt little guilt at all for not giving to the collection. In fact, I never really gave it much thought until February 1982, the year after I turned 18. Because that was when I received my first ever contribution letter from the church, which I saved. I still have it somewhere, but I don't need it to hand in order to quote it. I still remember very clearly what it said because it's seared into my memory. Dear Joseph, this letter is to serve as your receipt for tax or business purposes for your contributions to the Central Church of Christ for the calendar year 1981. You pledged $0.00 for the year, and according to our records, you gave $0.00. May God continue to prosper you as you give. Sincerely, the elders. Well, that stung. That stung. And it stung hard. And as soon as I was done licking my wounds, I started giving, and I gave my check. I didn't want another letter like that one. But it was another 7 years after that before I began tithing. And it isn't that it took me time to build up to it. No, before I started tithing, my goal was to give a respectable amount. To give enough that the men who were counting the collection and tracking it wouldn't think badly of me. I wasn't working up to anything. When I started tithing, I did that all at once. And by that time, my motivations had nothing to do with guilt, nothing to do with the elders of the church. No, they didn't know anything about tithing, at least not as far as I could tell. They didn't teach tithing at our church. Now, they didn't teach, as many churches do, that tithing was wrong. They just didn't teach on giving at all. Not hardly. What happened to me was that I encountered a Bible teacher who really understood giving from a biblical standpoint and whose teaching I found compelling. You see, beloved, I've been free to give all my life. But I didn't have a reason to give until I was 18. Now, the reason that I had was a bad reason. It wasn't for another 7 years after that I found a good reason. I didn't start tithing until I had a reason to do it. People think about, do I tithe? Well, why would you? It's a good question. Why would you? Why should you? Come back next week, and I'll tell you. That's my lesson for today.